Bill for a cooking show, no?
Really?
That was making well, it is a cooking show. There's a camera facing right at us.
I know. We're ready for you.
All right. We're just gonna get underway here.
One more minute.
I'm gonna start early. My name is Bonnie Fenwick. I am a culinary advisor for Real Food for Kids. I used to work at the Washington Post in the food section. I retired in 2019, and since then I've been recipe testing and editing other people's cookbooks. I also had the privilege of working with Chef Chris at the recent Chefs for Equality in the fall. And I've been a longtime fan of Real Food for Kids and their mission in local schools. So welcome everybody, and hi, Lucy, how are you? Come on and sit down. What you've been smelling, some people I told, but not everybody, it's not the fish dish that's listed in your program. It's Lamb and Pistachio Meatballs from Joon. Najmia Batman fell ill. She just has a head cold, came down with today. So I'm very sorry she won't be here today, but we'll try to make up for it by, I can talk to you about her. I've known her for at least 20 years. She and Chris go way back as well. And one of you, lucky people, by the end of the session will get to take home this cookbook. And the recipe for these meatballs is in this cookbook. And I've made the recipe several times myself, and I absolutely love it. So that's great. Yes, yes. I'm going to put this over here and get going. He's been cooking up samples for everybody, which we'll be able to give you. And I'm going to let you know who everybody is up here. This is Addie. She and Jack are helping garnish your samples today. They're excellent in the kitchen. Her dad is Ashad Imadi, who's the director of the Kitchen Collective Restaurant Group that Chef Chris is a part of. Chris Morgan is a local guy, went to Langley High School, graduated in 2006. Yeah. And he has been to culinary school. He'll give you sort of a brief rundown of the many restaurants and chefs all over the place that he's worked with. And then we'll get going on. He'll explain the recipe to you. And he's even going to show us how he chops chives. Who chops chives at home? Yeah. I just watched him, and I have envy. I have chive chopping envy. All right. Chris, why don't you tell everybody here a little bit about how you came to cook?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you guys for having me. Really excited to be here. I can tell you the last time I was in a school. Been quite a while. Yeah, so I started, I was telling them this earlier, I was kind of one of those kids that always, when my mom and dad were eating their food, the adult food at their table, and my two sisters and I were eating our food, which is fish sticks or whatever it was at the time, I was the first to want to leave the table and express interest in what my mom had to cook. And I remember she told me later on, she said she knew that she was in trouble because she was gonna have to start cooking for 3 earlier than she planned. But I got into cooking. I've always loved cooking. I was very experimental with cooking as a kid when I was helping my mom in the kitchen. My mom and her mother were great cooks. And I was fortunate enough to learn a lot from them. And then I think I really just chose cooking as a means to make money growing up. Other kids had summer jobs at pools or whatever it was, and I did a weird mix of construction and working in restaurants. And I fell in love with cooking. I didn't realize how much I loved cooking until I got to, so I went to a 4-year university at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, and studied economics. And my friends had saved more money when they were in high school than I had. So when we went out to places, I didn't have quite as much money as them. So I was seeking jobs to, be able to hang out with them on the weekends and make ends meet. And I found a really cool Thai restaurant, and I worked there for a year and a half. I ended up liking it so much that I worked 2 different jobs. I picked up another job at a French restaurant, And when a lot of my friends were out partying, I would have to bail and go to work, which for me was, a blessing because it taught me work ethic at a young age. I mean, I think in college, for me at least, that was when I really learned the true meaning of hard work. In high school, I definitely was, my parents raised me really well. I was excited to dive in on my studies, but when I found my true passion, which was cooking, I got really excited, and I think that's when I dove in for the first time. And I worked for places you would never have heard of in Wilmington, North Carolina, and one in Riceville Beach for a few years. And then I once again continued to kind of peruse the idea of continuing with my economics degree. So I moved back to DC, had a job offer, had 2 interviews, and then had the awkward conversation with my father that I was going to be moving to California to surf and also cook. And so that's where my next step was. I drove across the country, and I've never looked back. I was introduced to California cuisine, which was at then the peak, and it's fresh farm-to-table cooking, which we all know well now, but back then it was when it was in its prime. I got to work with the best ingredients, best chefs in the country, in the world, in fact. I worked for the late Judy Rogers, rest in peace, who ran
Zuni Cafe, right?
Zuni Cafe, who unfortunately passed away from cancer, but was a mentor of mine. Very hard to work for, but unbelievable. Funny story, I worked with her one day, and she brought in nasturtium, which is a beautiful flower, edible flower from her garden, which was used for a very nice dish that evening. And she had me and one other guy separate the flowers from the leaves, both of which are edible. They're kind of peppery, they're delicious. And the guy I was working with threw away the leaves because he just thought we were saving the flowers. I didn't know either, but that was my first moment of getting scared in the kitchen. But I luckily was the one saving the flowers. But anyway, I worked for her. I worked for Tracy Desjardins at Jardiniere, which is another one of the more iconic restaurants out of San Francisco. Worked for Charles Phan, who's an amazing Vietnamese chef at Slanted Door in San Francisco. And then I'm a mama's boy, so I ran home. I was away from home too long. And Jose Andres was at his peak around here at that time. I was seeking him out specifically, but I ended up finding a lot of amazing chefs doing a lot of amazing things. I staged at staging is when you do a tryout at a restaurant. I staged at about 17 restaurants in DC that year. This is 2013 or late 2012, 2013. And I found my way to the Partisan, which is part of the neighborhood restaurant group, no longer exists. I was executive sous chef there. Worked for an amazing guy named Nathan Anda, who's one of my mentors. Went to open the Dabney, won a Michelin-starred there as an executive sous chef with Jeremiah Langern, who's one of by far the best chefs in the country. And then I wanted to go out on my own. I think when I was in San Francisco, I really realized that pursuing my own restaurant was my ultimate dream, which is what put me head and shoulders above the rest of the people I was cooking alongside. A lot of kids, this is no slight to anybody, but some kids just decide to cook because it's a means to make money. For me, it was a passion, and it was, I didn't want to go back home to my dad and say that I was just, an hourly line cook at the age of 28. So my goal was to work with chefs that were in the opening processes for opening their own restaurants, to learn from them as best I could, to stay late, to show up early, to ask the right questions, to make mistakes, because that's allowed and it should be. And it brought me to where I am now. And after the Dabney, I left and I opened my own restaurant for the first time called Maidan. Very fortunate few years of my life. They all have been, but those in particular were quite incredible. We won a Michelin star. We got James Beard Best New Restaurant nomination.
Hard to get into that restaurant.
We won Bon Appetit, #2 best restaurant in the country. Food and Wine, #1 best restaurant in the country. Esquire, GQ, Travel and Leisure Magazine, all top 10. Eater, top 13 in the nation. It was a wild year, humbling beyond belief, but it is moments like that that made all those. I was making $7 an hour as a line cook in San Francisco for a very long time, and calling my mom crying when I couldn't afford my rent, and also scared to continue my line of work. But I have come a long way, and I'm now extremely excited to be back in the district. And post-maid honor, I met Ashad and some other amazing members of my now team at the Kitchen Collective. We run multiple restaurants in the area. We opened a restaurant late last July called Joon, Joon, with Chef Najmi and Bat Manglish, who can't be here, but if there is a queen of any cuisine in the world, that woman is the queen of Persian food, and she is the be-all, end-all when it comes to that cooking, so I'm just blessed to be able to work with her. She unfortunately isn't here, but I'm being very verbose, I'm sorry.
No, you're not. You're telling people all about you, which is great. And now you're the ripe old age of
36.
It's just made me tired just listening to everything. It's great. So, like I said, we're not making the fish dish today, but we are making the lamb and pistachio meatballs.
Yes, ma'am.
And these are served at Joon. Joon is in Tyson's Corner. Has anyone been? Should really go. That sour cherry rice, I've been talking about it ever since Chris showed up today. It's just great. And I really am sorry that you couldn't meet Naj, because she's always a font of fascinating information and stories. Her cookbooks are legend. Otto Lengi has gone on and on about them, and you can see them for sale at like Yekta Market in Rockville. And she's been teaching cooking classes in the area for decades. I was lucky enough to take them in her own kitchen, which I loved, and it's just great. And you met her a long time ago, right?
Yeah, so when I was out in San Francisco, my mother attended one of her cooking classes and told her about me and my love for that food. I went to Langley, as she mentioned before. A lot of my close friends are Iranian, so I was fortunate enough to enjoy that food at a young age. A lot of celebratory meals and things which are mind-blowing and puts my food culture to shame. So I was really excited to learn that food. My mom got her to sign a cookbook for me that said Happy Cooking Chef Najmi in 2012, right before I moved home. Started eating that food and cooking that food more regularly, and then I attended one of her cooking classes. She was a little under water with the amount of attendance and how much she had to put out while answering questions. So I raised my hand. She didn't know who I was at the time, and I ended up helping her that day. And then since then, I've worked with her on a bunch of her cookbooks, and we've been very close friends. She consulted for me at Maidon just as a phone a friend, and now we're business partners, and she's like a second mother to me. So I'm sad she's not here, but it's been a pretty cool journey.
But you can usually see her at the restaurant too, so that's another reason to go.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, so we're making today.
So today we're making lamb and pistachio meatballs. This is from Kerman, which is in the southeastern part of Iran. It's a very tasty dish that we have been serving since we opened. We rotate through a lot of dishes at the restaurant. This is one that you'll likely find forever. I would agree. You agree with that? Yeah. To show you how we make it, first and foremost, we have ground lamb. Our lamb is from Elysian Fields, a beautiful farm in Pennsylvania. Ground lamb. I did a little bit of the prep work in advance to make this easy, so I'm not sitting here grinding pistachios for 20 minutes. What we have, you want to come help me, bud? So if you want to whisk these eggs together.
This is Jack, who knows what he's doing in the kitchen.
So what we're going to do is we're going to add all the ingredients here. It's very, very simple. You can do this any number of ways. You can use a mixer, which is my preferred way to do it. If you have a standing mixer at home, you can use a food processor if you're doing a smaller batch of it. It will change the texture slightly, as it'll be a smoother texture on the interior. Because I don't have all the equipment with me, mine's going to be a more rough texture on the meatball. But if I had a food processor here with me, I could make that smooth texture, which is more of what you'll taste here. That's how I prefer to enjoy it. It emulsifies it more properly as well. So you have your ground lamb. We have some ground onion. I always drain the juice off of the onion, at least for this recipe. Do that for a number of reasons. The onion has a lot of sugar, a lot of flavor as well, obviously, but that liquid that drains off is going to contain a lot of that sourness from the onion that I don't care to enjoy in this. I want to bring acid from citrus as opposed to the onion itself. So you're getting beautiful onion, concentrated onion flavor that's been squeezed out, all that liquid's been removed, and then we're adding that in. We have ground pistachio quite a lot here.
And these pistachios you recommend, they're nice and green, which is always beautiful to see.
These are Afghani pistachios. So we work with a company, thank you so much, brother. We work with a company called Hooray Spice, a guy named Mohammed Salehi. I'm really intentional as to who I work with to buy any of my ingredients, and they do something really special. So he actually is a saffron farmer in Afghanistan, has a ton of single origin farms in Afghanistan that not only grow saffron, a bunch of other stuff, including pistachios, but their whole mission is to help people transfer over from poppy farming to saffron farming. Saffron is the most expensive ingredient by weight in the world, so it is quite profitable. But as you can imagine, there's reasons why poppy farming has been a thing in that part of the world for quite a while. So it's really special what they're doing. Plus 10% of all top line revenue, all cash that comes from the company goes to helping women in Afghanistan learn how to code, which is pretty special. I always like to work with people that have a good mission, if I can. So in addition here, we have our panko. This is gluten-free breadcrumbs, Japanese breadcrumbs. You can use dried bread of any kind. It really doesn't make a difference. But if you have a gluten intolerance, this is your bag here. So we're going to add that in. All right.
And in the cookbook, it says you can also use ground turkey.
Ground turkey, absolutely. So you can substitute this with ground turkey. You can also do it with fish. There's many ways to do this recipe. Any meatball can be, the type of protein you're using can change. That's quite easy. The only thing to consider, which is hard to write into a cookbook, is when you're adding a different protein, you have to consider the moisture content of said protein or the fat content. So if I'm using turkey, it's less fatty than lamb, right? I'm gonna probably compensate if I'm cooking at home with a little bit of extra fat. Maybe it's butter, maybe it's olive oil, whatever that is. Same thing with fish. You're losing a little bit of like that unctuousness that you get from a piece of lamb. So I might compensate with extra dry spices. That's me personally, or some more onion, those allium flavors, onion, garlic, kind of richen it up a little bit more where you might not with lamb. Or I might add fish stock or something, which you can quickly make. 15 minutes fish bones with water, maybe a dash of white wine.
All your chef friends are coming in the room now from judging.
Oh, look at that. Hi, guys. So next we're going to add our lime juice. Now the pressure's on. Now they're going to start judging me. Am I also being judged for this? Yeah, I love that.
It's an exhibition, not a competition.
Beautiful. And then I'm going to add salt here.
Chef, I'm going to pass around this for everybody to smell, the spice blend that you were telling us about.
So this is going to be a mix of cumin, Aleppo chili, and black pepper. This is going to be one of the primary spice mixes in the meatball. We also reconstitute the glaze, which we're making off to the side here in a second, with those very same flavors, minus the cumin. Cumin's beautiful, especially when it's toasted, it gets really nutty. I like Aleppo chili a lot. It is easy to find in any of the markets that we mentioned before. There's Yaz, there's Yekta, there's a million throughout the area. You don't need to go specifically to Aleppo. You can find in a lot of the Middle Eastern grocers throughout the area, but Yaz is actually an Iranian grocer, but that's where I personally purchase it, when I'm buying it for my house, that is. But it's fruitier, it's a little less heat, but the beauty of it is you can get that chili flavor without overpowering something with spicy. So you're not gonna you won't burn your tongue off, but you'll still have that really awesome, I'm eating something that has dried chilies in it flavor, which is what I'm really looking for. I like spicy. I tend to overdo it sometimes and am told by members of my team to dial it back quite often. But either way, this is one of my favorite chilies in the world. So I'm going to add in that same mixture we just discussed here. And then what I'm going to do is, Jackson, you mind coming over here with me, bud? I'm going to have him help me mix this. And then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to add the egg. So just get in there with your hands. Just going to massage it all in there together. So the idea is you're basically just trying to bring all the flavors together. When we mix in that egg, as I'm sure many of you made meatballs before, this process is very similar. After the fact, we're going to want to let it sit at the very minimum for 30 minutes in a cold environment. So in your fridge, I assume you don't have walk-ins at home. I was about to say that. But either way, I prefer to let mine sit at least 4 hours. I like to do that because I like the flavors to marry a little bit more. I have noticed a serious difference in making sausages and making meatballs, anything of that kind, any emulsified meat, in letting it sit for at least 4 hours. That's kind of my golden rule. Everyone has their own opinions on that, but that for me is what has worked over the years. You're doing an excellent job, bud. So we're
Chef,
going to keep.
if you were making these in advance, would you go ahead and cook them, or would you make the meat and the mixture and refrigerate it till you're ready to cook them? What would you do?
Exactly. So if you're making this for dinner or whatever, I would recommend doing it in advance, like earlier in the day, or the night before. Either one. Just I like to not only wrap it in plastic, but take a piece of plastic wrap and actually press down along the surface. What that'll do is that'll keep the meat from oxidizing. But I personally, whenever I'm doing this stuff, believe it or not, I still cook at home, even with all the restaurants, and then regret it the next day when I entertain because I'm too tired. But I always make this stuff in advance. I try to make as many things as possible in advance, so I love recipes where you can build something, kind of set it and forget it, right? And then the fun part, and you can have your guests do this with you, is you can roll out the meatballs, whatever, maybe your best friend's coming over in advance of the main shebang or whatever, and you can roll out the meatballs. And what we'll do after this is just for demos, so you guys can see kind of the process here. But typically, there's many ways to set meatballs. What I will do is I'll use a portion scoop. It looks like an ice cream scoop. And I'll do it so they're, uniform across the board, however many ounces you're looking for. It'll change the texture a little bit. But basically what I'll do is I'll lay those out on a sheet tray with parchment paper lined, right? A little bit of oil underneath. And then there's multiple ways you can cook it, right? You can set those in the fridge and let them sit like that. And then you can do what we did today, which is where you get a very hot pan, any fat, butter, a high heat oil, so something like grapeseed oil, canola oil, neutral in flavor is ideal for this. If you use olive oil, which has a smoking point of 350 degrees, you will burn, and it'll cause the flavor to become acrid, which none of us want, right? So you have beautiful flavors already. I like to use neutral oils as much as possible when doing high heat cooking. So I'll take the meatballs, I'll get the oil hot, and then I'll start to sear. Basically what you're doing is you're encapsulating that meatball, locking in all those flavors, locking in all that moisture. If you're to slow cook it, or like not have high enough of a flame, or in this case an induction burner not high enough of a temperature, which we had issues with earlier, what will happen is that meatball will start to fall apart. Also, you just won't get that beautiful exterior texture. What you're looking for always, in my opinion, with a meatball is beautiful exterior texture and a nice soft interior where it's got beautiful moisture and texture, so you have a nice rich bite when you bite into that meatball. The other way to do it, which is quite easy, one of the other ways to do it, is just to glaze it with a little bit of oil. You can do this or fat. You can do this with a brush. You can do this with a squeeze bottle. You can do it with your hand or a spoon. Is just to dress a little bit of the meatball on that parchment paper and then throw it in the oven. You can do that at a higher heat temperature is my ideal way to do that. I'll do it about 425. I'll pull it out about halfway through the cooking process and then roll it over so it gets a little more color on the reverse side, pop it back in the oven. Once again, I don't take this thing all the way, for these meatballs that is, because I'm finishing them in a sauce of pomegranate molasses, grape molasses, and pomegranate juice, all of which are seasoned with Aleppo chili and black pepper. So all three of these I bring up together in a pot, get them hot, and then with the meatballs that he's finishing over here, we'll pour over that sauce, and the idea is those meatballs are going to soak up all the richness of that sauce, right? You have a sweet, sour glaze. Grape molasses is unbelievable. This is one of my favorite ingredients in the world. Not to discredit the other two, but this is absolutely beautiful. I use this in sweet applications, savory applications. It is a lot of fun to work with, and it gives you this, it tastes like Concord grapes that are cooked down. If you've ever like a Concord grape jam, it almost, for me, that's what it reminds me of. I grew up with Concord grapes in my backyard, and this is kind of like that with a more acid and punch to it, and I absolutely love working with it. And then pomegranate molasses and pomegranate juice give it a nice sourness, but really rounds out the sauce. So we'll make that sauce, mount it with butter. By that I mean I add cold butter to the sauce when it's hot, mix it in together at a lower heat to let it emulsify properly, and then I'll glaze the meatballs in that. But if you're doing this for a party, you can, like we're doing here, you just get all your meatballs ready, transfer it to a pot, pour the hot glaze over top of it, and just let it sit. And then all you got to do is scoop them out, put them on a plate, and garnish it as you see fit. But at the restaurant, we serve these in portions of 5 to 6, and garnish it with pomegranate seeds, pistachios, a little bit of rose petal, chive, in that very same glaze.
It's beautiful. It's even beautiful as a single sample. But when you were talking, mounting is one of those chef terms, so just sort of drop it back a little bit and tell people what you mean by that. And also, do you recommend any particular kind of neutral oil?
So, I mean, you can go any number of ways. I use grapeseed oil a lot. But honestly, at my restaurant, most of the time we use canola. It's a high heat neutral oil that's not super expensive, and I use for most of my high heat cooking. When you can buy things called blended oils. Now, this is a variation of different oils depending on who you're buying it from, but it's usually an 80-20 blend. It can be a 70-30 blend or 85-15 blend typically, meaning it is 90% olive oil or 80% olive oil, and then 10 or 20% of that neutral oil, which is high heat. That offsets the 350 smoking point of your olive oil and allows you to cook at a higher temperature while imparting that same olive oil flavor. So when I'm making salad dressings, for example, I use blended oils about 50% of the time, depending on the application, to olive oil, because sometimes olive oil is such an intense flavor, and there's a lot of olive oil in my food, that it overpowers the rest of the flavors in the dressing. But yeah, so when, as she was mentioning before, when you're mounting something with butter, typically you're trying to emulsify something, right? So you're trying to bring two things that don't want to mix and have them mix together, right? So I'm bringing a hot liquid, I'm adding, intentionally I keep the butter cold, that helps it emulsify, but what happens is I'm going to bring up this liquid, and as soon as it starts to bring to a boil, and I have it tasting exactly where I want it to be, and all it needs is that little bit of butter to finish it, I'm going to drop the temperature ever so slightly, I'm going to add the butter in off the heat, and I'm going to slowly whisk it together. What that's going to do is it's going to allow those two liquids that are two ingredients that don't want to mix, it's going to allow them to emulsify more easily. If you're to boil it, you'll see the fat and the liquid separate almost immediately. You've seen that if you're making any sauce at home and it's boiling too high, and your water and your whatever it is you're making, and your fat separating from the liquid, that's because it's too high heat and you probably didn't properly emulsify the two liquids together. There's ways to fix that, ice cubes, other things. I'll let you Google that. But either way, yeah.
How are those meatballs? Really delicious, right? Right. And I promised you a chef chive chopping. I can't even say that fast.
Chive chopping?
Yes, chive chopping. So we're going to move this out of the way so that you can show people how to do
Cool.
that. And you guys are going to be thinking about questions, and then we'll give away that cookbook.
So a lot of you are familiar with chives at home. We asked earlier, correct? I love chives. They bring that really nice allium flavor without being too oniony. You'll see them all over my food at the restaurant. So for chives, really starts with just picking out the chives, picking the nice chives to make sure that there's no wet chives in the bunch, because when you go to chop it, if anything is damp, it will cause them to get really muddy really quickly, and by that I mean they'll just get kind of mushy. I'm sure you've seen that before, right? Like if you leave asparagus in the fridge too long, or scallions, green onions, you'll see that wet tip. If you have any of that in here when you go to chop them, they won't look very pretty. I do this as, I'm very intentional with my presentation of food, that I'm looking for flavor as well as all the visuals. I think those go hand in hand, but I wouldn't do one without the other. So for me, what I do is I try to get a nice tight bunch of chives. There's tricks to this, so you can take a paper towel and you can wrap it tightly and roll it around. So you can literally create like a beautiful uniform log, essentially, of your chives, which is a really fail-safe way to make sure that all the chives stay nice and pretty and bunched together. When you're chopping anything, you have this little claw hand, right? So when I'm dropping anything over here, I've already evened out my chives at the top. The idea is you don't want to nick this guy, which I've done too many times, or your knuckles. So what you want to do is you want to bring your hand back, kind of use the knife to let yourself set up at the front. And then what you're going to do is you're going to draw the knife down.
Look at those chives.
Beautiful like that. The idea is you're not sawing through it, you're not pushing through it. You're slowly rocking your knife back and forth, forward and backward. That's the key to cutting anything if you want to cut it beautifully and slice it. At least when it comes to herbs, that's how I personally like to do it. When you try to go straight top to bottom, you're going to push through, you're going to bruise the herb, whether it's parsley, cilantro, anything. It could be a harder herb like rosemary. You'll still notice the color differential between that and when you can actually nicely stroke through it. So it's really just about a clean, smooth stroke through. And then if you ever have any issues with them, like one's shooting out and whatever, all you got to do is just kind of reset, pull them back together. Like I said, a paper towel wrapped around, which I don't have on me, does a world of good as well. But the idea with your fingers is, you see my knuckle here, it's kind of acting as a guard. So I know that there's no way, at least if I'm paying attention, and I'm trying to multitask too much, that I won't nick the top of my knuckle, right? So I'm kind of using my fingers, and then I'm slowly going to pull my left hand back, which you'll see here. So I'm just slowly moving my hand back.
We're clapping for chives.
I need you guys in the restaurant. I do this too often. But that's the gist of it. So, like I said, I love having chives at home. I think it's a really nice way to, add a little green to a lot of dishes now. Once again, if there's onions and garlic and things in a dish, it usually makes sense to add chives on top, at least for presentation's sake, and adds a bit of flavor as well.
Thank you, Chef. All right, who's got a question? All right, let's see if we can get a microphone for you back there. It's coming. It's coming. Good job, Chef. I know. Annie says it's so good.
So my question is there or what's the secret, what's the trick with the meatballs or even any ground beef, getting the right internal temperature without burning the outside?
So it greatly depends on the protein that you're using, as well as the temperature at which you're cooking. So for me, I have found, now there's different schools of thought on this, but I have found that very cold protein, so meaning if you're making a mix like this, it needs to be refrigerated. And then I use depending on the meat itself, it could be anywhere from 425 to 450 for meatball searing if I'm doing it in an oven. That is what I like to do. I have a lot of friends who cook Italian food that will fry meatballs to seal the outside like we talked about, and then low and slow finish it in an oven. You can do that in a sauce. You can do that. I mean, there's a million ways to do it, and meatballs are made in many different countries. I personally like to chill the meatballs, like I was saying before. I don't actually temp them. It's really just a feel thing for me. I'll just, based on whatever recipe I'm working on, I'll just make sure that the texture, as long as it's no longer soft to the touch, you've got just that, as soon as it hits that firm exterior, right, when you're giving it a little touch, then for me, that's where it needs to be. Now, if I'm finishing it in a sauce like I am with this, I'm gonna take it out a little bit early, right? So this, I don't wanna take it the whole way. I wanna let the outside, get that seal like I was telling you about before, that nice exterior, and then I'm gonna drop it into a sauce, and I'm gonna rely on that sauce to finish the cooking process.
The recipe in the cookbook calls for doing it in the oven, and that's how I've done it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It works quite well.
All
And
right.
then, yeah.
So chef, I have a question, and this is something my grandmother taught us growing up. Handling the meat, when you're mixing the ingredients in, are you gonna mix it until it's already dead, but is it, what's your opinion on how much should you mix your ingredients?
For this recipe or in general?
In general.
It's hard to say. I think, you know, it really depends. If you're making sausage, for example, you have to be, it's very time sensitive. Everything has to be as cold as humanly possible. Everything needs to be done very, very fast. When I'm making sausages, every single thing that I'm working with, every ingredient, including the equipment itself, has been in the freezer. I will take my meat and throw it in the freezer for 10 minutes just to get it extra cold before I grind it. Because it'll emulsify better and the ultimate texture and the end result will be much tastier and more to my liking. Now, mixing things, you can overmix a lot of things and ruin recipes. It really depends on the recipe. I just would adhere to whatever, whether it's your grandma's recipe, she's probably got the right answer for that one. But for something like this, you know, if you guys are making this recipe at home, the goal is just to get it till it's a nice, homogeneous texture. So basically you're gonna, like I said, these ones are ground separately. I would recommend doing this in a food processor where you actually pulse everything together until it forms into more or less a paste, right? So it really, yeah, it's hard to say. It depends so much because you can mix, I mean, doughs, I would say the most temperamental thing though is over mixing doughs. Meats, be very careful, but if you're playing with flour, that is when you really need to pay attention to time and how often and how much you're mixing.
So her theory was the less you mix it, the more fluffier that meatball's gonna be.
That's
Pound it, it's really dense, so I don't know.
That's fair. I would say it depends though. So this is like a very herb heavy meatball. So and I'm just remembering as I said that, there are herbs in my cooler I did not add to the meatball. So that should have been green. No, but the one you tasted everything in it. But, so for certain things like herbs, right, you have that water in the herbs, right, that water content, that's gonna help it with its over the end texture when you're finished cooking, right? But I think you have to be careful, like you said, you don't want to overmix meatballs. If I'm making like a traditional Italian meatball, for example, I'm very quick with my entire process. I'm not going to over pulsate that if I'm using a food processor. But if I'm making a fish meatball or something, I'm actually going to spend a good bit of time to try to create like a mousse, essentially, so you can get a really soft texture on the meatball. So it really depends. But yeah, for like a very traditional Italian meatball, if we're using that as a point of reference, I would recommend not over mixing. That can result in a different texture of the meatball.
All right, you got time for a couple more? Yes? Wait, just a second. Microphone coming to you.
Is there any vegetarian substitute you can recommend
For these?
For the lamb, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you could. I would have to help you adjust the recipe accordingly. I do have a ton of vegetarian meatball recipes if you're interested.
Okay.
But I mean, nuts are a beautiful substitute. I've used squash. I've used, trying to think, cauliflower actually makes a beautiful meatball.
Do you do a vegetarian meatball?
I've done them for events.
Okay.
I don't have one currently on the menu, but I've done one for events. Yeah.
Okay.
But I'd happily, yeah, if you want, I can help you work through one, no problem.
There are quite a few vegetarian recipes in this book, though. That's going to be given away in just a minute. We have time for one or two more questions. Are we good? You were pretty good. You answered. I've told people about a lot of things. Chef, thank you very much.
Very well.
So the herbs are going in right now.
Yeah.
And that's
Best for last. This was intentional.
And that's one of the reasons why these meatballs are so very green, right?
Yeah, so it's parsley, cilantro, and tarragon primarily, all mixed in.
And they're fresh, right?
Yes, ma'am. So these are pulverized. Reason for that being you get that beautiful green color throughout the meatball. Almost spreads like a paste, right? and it turns into that beautiful, beautiful color. So when you break into that meatball, you get that nice green interior.
All right, so let's hear it for Chef Chris and his helpers. And now for the good giveaway stuff. If you turn around and look at the top of the back of your chair, if you've got a red dot on it, you own this cookbook. Who's got it? Everybody's looking. There you go. I think she's our youngest cook today. There you go. Very, very much for coming. Thanks again to Chef Chris.
Thank you guys for having me. I really appreciate it.
Kitchen Collective Group, and you guys are going to have a great time at the rest of the event. Thanks very much.